Dear Mr. President, friends, welcome to the panel discussion on designing peace. What is actually, if you think about it, what does designing peace actually mean? You can start approaching the topic by trying to understand what kind of circumstances bring about peace. What kind of physical environment? What kind of issues do the people who have a conflict struggle with? For this, I'm trying to decode what kinds of different elements impact the conflicts that we have. We have a panel of 4 distinguished guests, all experts in their own field, who are going to share some of their insights and their work on trying to make peace happen and to bring collaboration between different people about. This is legendary. This always happens. Did you hear anything that I just said at the back? Excellent. We can move on. So please, panelists, if I could ask you to all introduce yourselves, maybe starting from Claudia, please.
So I'm Claudia Garduño García. I am from Mexico. I was born and raised there. And that's also where I studied industrial design just before coming to Finland to start a master's, where I also studied a doctoral degree. I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher in the sustainability group in the design department of Aalto University. And I've been working in the past years in building the concept of design as freedom, where the process of design is equated to the process of exercising freedom, in the sense that we might want to have some things done and we need to create the strategies to get there. I'm also a purposefully naive person, coming from Mexico, where conflicts tend to be a little bit more complicated than in Finland. I push myself to be naive because for as long as I know that our tiny little projects in Mexico are not going to change the world, I ought to believe that we can work together very hardly so that they might mean the world to some.
Thank you. And Matti.
Hi, my name is Matti Nelimarkka, and I'm postdoctoral researcher at Aalto University, Department of Computer Science. My background is mixed in political science and computer science. I actually have masters in political science also. And nowadays I'm researching the intersection of politics and social computing.
Thank you. And Alex.
Yeah, I'm Alexander Stubb, and I'm the chairman of the board of the CMI, trying to modestly follow in the footsteps of President Martti Ahtisaari, and I'm an international relations buff. My PhD is in international relations from the London School of Economics, and I've been working with things international and peace-related, both as an academic, as a civil servant, and then later on in politics.
Thank you. And finally, Olli.
Yes, my name is Olli Varis. I work as a professor at Water Resources Management at the Department of Built Environment here at Aalto University. I've been working with water, but not only on water, but also with the people who are dealing with water. And I have never seen a person who doesn't use water for something. And many of us use water for many things. And our industries do use water. And also the nature is living on water. So this is the modest world that I'm studying and investigating and teaching.
And are we sponsored by Vision Novel? I think.
I suppose we are. How convenient. Thank you. And I did forget to introduce myself. I got confused by the mic. My name is Piia Kuosmanen. I'm an alum of this university from Information Networks. And my background is mostly doing crazy social projects, such as taking the Slush startup event to China, or teaching coding workshops to children in Uganda. So my background is varied, and currently I'm the CEO of a small company called Paragraaffi, which is aiming to make legal services affordable and easy to use to everyone. And a fun fact, I guess, would be that I have a constant guilt about not doing enough to save the world, and I'm trying to struggle with it because I know there is only so much one person can do. And I think that is something that all of us share on some extent, because all of your work is also closely related, trying to make things better for others. We did hear something about the importance of diversity in peace effort, in collaboration. What are your thoughts on that, Alex? You've seen a lot of conflict. You've seen a lot of collaborative processes.
Yeah, well, I guess my sort of most intimate and personal experience of peace mediation was the war in Georgia in 2008, in August actually. And all I can really say is that at the end of the day, conflicts and peace mediation is about interaction between human beings, and quite often on the highest level it's about interaction and how to deal and manage egos. We flew in on August 9th to Tbilisi together with the French foreign minister, and of course at that time Russia had attacked Georgia and the conflict was alive, and our aim was to try through peace mediation to get through a situation whereby the conflict would stop. And on one side of the ego table we had President Saakashvili of Georgia, and the other side we had Prime Minister Putin of Russia, and one of the peace mediators was President Sarkozy of France.
So you have your hands full there.
Hands full of egos, yes. And at the end of the day, it's a question of trying to sustain, mitigate the situation, come up with a list that then creates a ceasefire. Sometimes it takes time. In this particular case, it only took 4 to 5 days, which was quite fortunate. But then again, the two conflicts that we created are now frozen and in many ways, unfortunately, long-lasting. One of them in South Ossetia and the other one in Abkhazia. So that was my concrete experience of peace mediation. Pretty scary after 4 months as foreign minister, I must admit.
I can also imagine afterwards you start thinking, well, what happened there? A lot of scary situations. I understand also in Mexico there is currently a big crisis ongoing. Claudia, can you tell us a little bit about the situation there at the moment?
Yeah, well, the situation is pretty complex because we are not only dealing with the matters that are always there, such as high levels of poverty, like 52 million people living in poverty, or how we are prone to natural disasters, which have intensified because of climate change. But now, on top of that, we have, of course, the war on drugs, a strategy which has not come out very successfully, or not at all. It's left around 2,200,000 people killed since 2008. And we have also close to 38,000 people who are missing, and very many that have been displaced. So then, of course, on top of that, we now have the migration crisis. So we have the caravan going through our territory, and with the recent elections, what has happened is we have a very, very polarized society, and you can see a lot of violence going on now in social media like it had never happened before. So they're pretty tough.
And polarization, I suppose, is something that everyone is talking about these days. If I just ask the audience, please raise your hand if you think there is too much polarization going on in the social media these days. Quite a few. And now, Matti, you have been researching how conflicts developed in social media and in collaboration, discussion between people. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, something really interesting is sort of the ongoing academic debate, which is, does technology cause it or do people cause it? And I don't really know where I stand in that, because it's, of course, a mix of both of those things. But it used to be, and now if we look at, for example, fake news discussion in the US, they always blame that it's the technologies that cause them. And it really reflects back into the fact that why it's so hard for us to understand that it's also the people who are doing it. I was studying Finnish migration discussion. It was horrible, like totally horrible in terms, but it was surprisingly horrible because it was on the both sides of the, we call them camps in the discussion. So we had pro-migration and anti-migration, and the level of distrust towards the other camp, it was enormous. And that happened in the both of the camps, which was surprising for me, because I was assuming that there would be one camp only with that kind of strong opposition and strong arguments. And I'm happy to say that on the paper that we wrote, we actually have on the ethics statement, we said that we read like 200 messages and then we stopped due to concerns of psychological harm for researchers, which it got published, which is super surprising in academic settings. But that also tells you about the content that we went through to make that research happening and the level of hostility present there.
Do you see this level of hostility on face-to-face situations, or is it just on social media?
Anyone
Anyone
can
can go.
the way,
Please,
I really like what Matti said, and I think it's caused by humans, not by technology as such. One of the big problems is that if political leaders provide a discourse of hate and contempt and fear, whether the technology or mode is social media, Twitter, or whatever, that sort of justifies rogue behavior, I think, in the general public as well. And of course, I don't need to hide it. The type of language that President Donald Trump uses about other human beings, I think is undignified and contemptful against others. And when that happens,
Mexico, for example,
especially,
right?
well, Mexico is just one example, and then suddenly it becomes the new normal. Of course, human memory is such that you have a tendency to forget all the bad or the good stuff in the long run. But right now, I feel that the type of language that's being used is indeed very frustrating. My final point on this is, today when we had Ahtisaaripäivät and we went to a lot of schools. One of the things I say about behavior in social media is that we should think about it as if we were sitting in a living room or kitchen or a classroom or here. So whatever I say to you right now here is exactly the same thing that I should say to you in social media. The wall of social media, I think, does not allow for uncivilized behavior, but somehow it happens. It's like the old, do you remember when there was a telephone line that you could call and then have a discussion, and because you didn't see the other human being, a lot of people misbehaved, and we have that in social media. Now, silver lining, final point, I think that today's youth are probably a little bit better at behaving at social media.
We have to hope so, right?
Yeah, than we are. It could be a generational thing as well.
It could be, and then it always goes back to actual human beings, I guess, who are behind the screen, right?
Yeah, so what I find really interesting in this discussion is that there's a bunch of literature actually from 1990s already speaking about the differences of computer-mediated communication and this kind of actual face-to-face communication or non-mediated communication. And already at that point of time, people observed that it's really hard to discuss about difficult things. Yeah. There's easy ways to misunderstand. And of course, all of these fall into quite many of these, if we think about, well, Parliament of Finland and some of the somekohut that they've had. There seems to be either malicious misunderstanding or then proper misunderstanding taking place in that discussion, that in the face-to-face situation, usually people would correct when they see that someone is looking at you like this, and they would be like, oh, I meant it in this way or that way.
I fully agree, but at the same time, now that I'm taking distance from politics, I must admit that watching Prime Minister's Question Hour is a rather uncomfortable thing at times, because there is fairly, I think, uncivilized and rogue behavior as well. And it's part of the theater in it, which I think theater is fine in politics as long as it's sophisticated. But when it goes beyond sophistication and when there's a feeling that people are still, bashing each other, I find it quite uncomfortable.
We can come back to this topic a bit later, but I want to also ask Olli about the reasons why people go into conflict. You have been researching water and resources and the impact of that on how people behave. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, there is a kind of concept or notion of water wars, but I think this is usually it's the other way around. Usually water is used as a kind of a mediator of conflicts rather than directly as a source of conflict. There is a notion in diplomacy called multi-track diplomacy, and it means that there are several levels where diplomacy is being done, and the first track, the political track, was the one that Alex mentioned before, where the politicians sit together and try to solve the conflicts. And below that there are a couple of other tracks, and one is a kind of specialist or technical track. And water is very often there on the table, because water is such a basic thing and basic need for people, and also kind of a issue which can be used for peace building. I've been working in several countries like Cambodia and Laos and even in Yemen and Syria and so forth on that level. And it's quite interesting to see how we can bring people closer to each other by just looking for solutions and looking for shared interest. There are usually lots of shared interests if you go to these kind of basic things.
So you enable people to have access to water, is that what you mean? And then it will be easier to agree on other topics as well? Or?
Yeah, it's more. It's often on the ministerial level or something like that, where you bring policies closer to each other and encourage countries to share data and share information and make contracts and these kind of things, and sign EU agreements and or United Nations agreements and these kind of things. It's not directly at the political level, but it's more on the technical side. But close collaboration to the political level.
And one of the things that we've found, I mean, is obviously basic needs are a great cause of conflict in many ways. I think there's an old saying that the difference between civilization and barbarism is 3 meals. That, you know, when you're deprived of food, water, and basic needs, you know, it's very, very difficult to avoid conflict, because that stage we sort of change behavior. But then when you get beyond that, which Olli was I think outlining very well, is what one of the things that President Ahtisaari very often says is that after the conflict has been solved, you need other types of basic needs. They might have to do with education, they might have to do with equality, tolerance, and these types of basic needs of a functioning society in order for that peace to be sustainable. I mean, it would, for instance, be very difficult right now to go into conflict, say, between the Nordic countries, because, you know, we're very well off Nordic welfare states with high levels of equality and also fairly mitigated income inequality. But, you know, that can be tilted unless you keep on nourishing it all the time. I'm simplifying, but this is the way in which we would see it at the CMI.
Something that I found interesting in Olli's sort of talk was trying to separate the politics from the technical details, because I think that the Silicon Valley industries have now figured out that you truly cannot separate those. It helps if you lose like $500 million from your capital, so it helps you to understand that. But I think that there's now been a lot more of discussion of that, and the question is that how should we, when we are doing our teaching or when we are speaking about these issues, also try to not separate those, but actually try to bring them more close together, because they are connected, as you saw. So resource management is supporting politicians and political parties and stuff like that.
Positive peace that was brought out earlier. How can your research contribute to that, for example?
And in a way, I think water is a very good example, because it's come everywhere. Everywhere where we've visited, water has come out as a big challenge, because sometimes you're talking about water quality, sometimes you're talking about water scarcity, sometimes you're talking about floodings. There are many ways in which water becomes important. But it's also a very interesting challenge, because water behaves very specifically. It's always different. We've been working together with Olli Varis, and his students have been coming and taking samples of water and testing it. And we have to do it every time, because if it's rainy season, it's different from the dry season. And if it's one year from the other, things can change. It's not only it's not only political and technical, it's also very social. And the way you manage your water systems has, of course, then an impact. But having it in place is, I think, one of the ways of, if not avoiding war, at least keeping peace.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at one region, so you look at, for instance, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and the like, I mean, water is a key issue there, which is then balanced off with other natural resources, such as oil and gas. And if you take it one step further, I mean, we have a tendency to forget that the European Union was basically, yes, built as a peace project and built on the basis of values as a political project, but the instruments that we used were actually those of heavy industry. So the whole idea of the coal and steel community was to tie in German and French war industry so intimately together that it would make war impossible. And in that sense, I think, Olli's thesis of I guess, two-level games, Putnam-style two-level games on the political level and the technical level is a good way of looking at it. Sometimes, having been more involved in the political level, I see politicians as impediment to peace rather than facilitators, but that's part of the process, I guess.
It's interesting to ask what incentives politicians have for promoting long-term peace, actually. How do you see that?
Well, they vary so much. There are countries who actually prefer to have non-democratic, unstable, almost belligerent neighbors. I won't mention any countries, but they create spheres of interest around them where they want to see destabilized neighborhoods. Whereas I guess here in Finland and in many other countries as well, what you want to do is to have good and orderly and peaceful neighborly relations. Now, the difference, of course, nowadays is that the whole line between war and peace is quite blurred. I mean, we've seen that. We wouldn't be talking about water, we wouldn't be talking, about technology if that wasn't the case. Previously, war meant acquisition of land or materia. Nowadays, it can be something completely different. We've just had a case here in Finland of GPS disturbances. We might have a case of basic infrastructure being somehow tampered with, or the banking system being tampered with, or information wars. And we talk a lot about, cyber wars, but the whole idea is that there's an alternative cost to acquiring land, so it's not worth it anymore. Yes, it still happens, but we're moving into a different sphere of peace, and that's why the presentation that we just had from the Peace Labs is great, because it also shows that peace is not only about acquiring land, it's about using language and trying to mediate different types of conflicts.
I think you're right, and I think it also means that the actors you're going to be dealing with are changing as well. Sometimes in a conflict, you no longer know exactly who has been causing what. Am I correct? So do you have any thoughts on that, on the panel?
Well, I can start with sort of about political communication in US, and there was a striking article speaking how Facebook and Twitter, etc., they provide consultancy to the candidates on how to use the platform most efficiently. And that consultancy is actually organized by party factions, so Democrats get Democrat members trying to support that, and I found that super surprising, mainly in terms that they are meddling with the elections in such deep level that they are providing their own experts of their own groups that, okay, how are we going to do this? And it sounds really scary, actually.
Yeah. It's one of the things, actually, I think big data is one of the big issues. That was mentioned in one of the interventions earlier, and the way in which data is used, because we know that data nowadays, it's like money, it's like oil,
currency,
it's like gold, it's currency, and it's very valuable. And I think the mention was made of every interaction that we do on the social media can then be put into place. And of course, as technology develops, we start using algorithms. We get into a world where data starts to take over. And my big thinking has been on this, and there's already movement, I think, on the UN, United Nations side, is that we need to have some kind of a covenant, some kind of an international agreement on the use of data, on the use of algorithms before we start moving towards some kind of singularity. Because originally constitutions and international treaties were there to protect the minority from the majority, or to protect a nation state and its territorial integrity. Well, what if you start to infringe data, which is basically in a borderless world the new commodity? Then you are engaged in some kind of warfare, and we need to have rules on this, I think, before it's too late. And I'm sure we'll come up with rules as well, but the best place to do this is the UN.
Yeah, and I think there's also upsides to gathering data, and I guess when you are trying to facilitate collaboration between different parties who disagree on something, you often don't necessarily have all the information that you would need available. Am I right? Yeah. There are challenges to gathering that data. So there are maybe new opportunities there as well.
Yeah, and I'm guessing there's always not necessarily a conflict just because you are different people. Our experience on the very far edge, so working with really small groups of students, working in indigenous communities in Mexico, bringing people from as many disciplines as we can, it's been about everybody talking together and creating things together. So being different does not necessarily mean conflict. On the other hand, it actually means the complete opposite, I believe. So we've created these very nice interactions where we've been able to create some concepts, and we haven't been able to yet implement them all fully. But at least I think what has happened is we have generated very valuable experiences for students who maybe one day will be working in the United Nations. Some of them who have been studying here in Aalto University, maybe some of them will end up working in NGOs and going back to communities. But our hopes is that whatever they do, they will put that into practice from wherever they will be standing.
I want to ask you again about natural resources, because the planet is approaching a crisis, and the resources that we require are getting scarcer, and there are more people who are looking to use those same resources, fossil fuels, clean water. Do you think that this is also going to be the reason for more and more conflicts, or are we going to see new different kinds of conflicts? Are we going to see something that we haven't seen so far? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, this is a very, very tough question, and
I know.
And there is lots of different cases throughout the world. So one thing is that maybe a little bit kind of parallel to the slogan of Ahtisaari days, that a big part of this scarcity issue is man-made. So it can perhaps also be solved by human beings. For instance, if we talk about land degradation or deforestation or biodiversity loss or water pollution or these kind of issues which cause lots of trouble to people and also to farmers and other people, it's kind of solvable if it can be kind of governed, and if there is a political will and if there is a skill to do that. There are areas which have kind of turned the tide. Europe is one of them. So we used to have lots of more environmental problems than we have now. 30 years ago, 40 years ago, we have new ones. That's okay, but still there is a kind of a hope, and this is something that. When we are working at the technical field, this is a kind of guideline that we, at least a kind of optimism that we want to spread to the people, that let's move on and let's try to solve these problems. Yeah. It's not kind of absolute scarcity; it's partly man-made.
I fully agree. If I can bring two books and Matti Ahtisaari into this, the two
sure,
books.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the two books that I would bring in is all three books of Yuval Harari, and then the other one I would bring in is Hans Rosling's Factfulness. Why do I bring these in? And then Matti Ahtisaari. Well, Yuval Harari, I think, quite well points out that the three main causes of death have basically been overcome by humans. The first one was obviously famine and food. More people die nowadays of obesity than scarcity. The second one is wars and conflict. I'm not saying that they're completely over, but less than 500,000 people a year die of wars and violent crime, which of course is way too much, but is a hell of a lot less than what we've seen, in human history in general. And the third one is disease. So we die more of old age than we die of disease, which I think is obviously credit to science and the development of mankind. If you add on to that Hans Rosling's analysis and obviously his fellow researchers on fact and factfulness, and look at human development, say in the past 200 years, on life expectancy, on childbirth, on famine, for instance, climate and other things, you start seeing a pattern that actually human beings are quite good at solving problems. And then you come to the Martti Ahtisaari thesis that you know, every conflict or situation that has been created by a human being can be solved, you know, by a human being. As Olli said, you know, that brings me at least a lot of hope that it's doable. Final point on this, the example I take from Hans Rosling's book is demography and climate change. Now, if the Earth's temperatures will increase by 2 degrees by the end of the century.
Probably will.
Probably will, but hopefully not. And if and when the demography will change so that Africa will go from 1 billion inhabitants to 4 billion inhabitants, I think the rest of the world will at some stage wake up and seriously try to find solutions, because they will see that this will not only lead to the types of natural scarcities and lack of resources that Olli mentioned, but it will also lead to mass migration, and mass migration leads to insecurity, because at the end of the day people don't necessarily want to leave the place that they're born. So, you know, I think we have a lot of big issues to solve in the next decades, in the next century, but I do think that they are actually all solvable, technology being a big part of it. This could be just my silver lining, but I'm hopeful.
I think there's got to be a silver lining. I think we still have to believe that we can change the future, because if we can't, then who can? So on that note, I would actually like to ask the final question from all of you. What can we do, for example, us in this room, in your opinion, to help make tomorrow a better place for all of us? In any order that you want. Go.
Well, for me, it is more about understanding that these problems are truly wicked, and try to understand that we cannot address these using the usual academic disciplinary boundaries or the usual functional boundaries, but we need to actually get our act together on these issues and do something. Because if we don't, well, whatever.
I will build on Matti's words and say that from where I'm standing, let's see the disciplinary side, I believe that designers can help in making these creative processes. So not only coming together, but making it more creative than it normally is. From the academia side, I also think that universities should really focus on making of their students agents of change. So they are not just going to continue living life as normal, but they will try to really make some change from wherever they stand. And from my NGO perspective, of course, we should continue with our projects, working together with people, trying to build better places, and then I guess also making some pressure on the politicians.
Yeah, these two colleagues made my job difficult, because I was going to say very much the same things, but I think it's very important to educate here people who are very skillful in something, but at the same time who are able to work together, as President Ahtisaari said, and we can also try to provide thoughts and opportunities for students to tackle really important problems, and not really go always after the highest impact journals or something like that, but really look at the burning problems and issues, solutions that can create impact and that can change something. We have lots of good cases here, even at this university, like finding replacements for cotton and polyester and so forth. And as a team effort, looking at solutions and looking them together and trying to make them really work in practice.
I'm reminded everything has been said, but it hasn't been said by everyone yet. So, I'll give my 2 cents worth with probably 2 comments. One is, I think we need to go back to values. You know, I seriously believe that we need to look at what have been the best values for a successful society. And for me, a lot of times they have to do with democracy, rule of law, fundamental rights, human rights, equality, tolerance, freedom. when you basically allow a human individual to flourish and you give him or her equal opportunity. And when that clicks, there comes a sense, I think, of justice and fairness. And then my second point is actually going more into your territory. I think we need to go back to Aristotle and kind of realize that the most noble job that you can have in life is to teach the young. And if the young are taught and given a certain direction which is based on these values, I think solutions will follow. I have 2 kids myself. Emily is 17 and Oliver is 14. I look at their kin and their friends, and that gives me at least a lot of hope, because they don't necessarily approach life from an ideological perspective. They approach it from a values-based perspective. And if these kids keep those values, if they keep on staying curious and open for all of their lives, then I think a lot of conflicts and problems at the end of the day will be solved. So if you stick to values and good education, I think the world will be a hell of a lot better place.
I want to thank you, all of you, for this panel. I think we have come through, realized how complicated designing peace, making peace happen is, but also the fact that we have a lot of tools and there are a lot of ways in which we can advance peace in the world. And personally, as a millennial, I think being able to ask you guys questions and to hear your answers, and I'm left with a positive feeling about the future. And I hope that the rest of you guys have been left with that feeling as well, because in the end it is in our hands, and there are a lot of things that we can all do to make the world a better place tomorrow for everyone. So I want to thank you, panelists, and I want to thank the audience for this panel as well, and we'll move on with the program. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.